Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Bartlett Gardening University. Today we're going to be talking about trees, and we'll be talking about having the right tree in the right place. So let's talk a little bit about how to care for them. And why do we even want trees? Well, trees are pretty important to us because they're our longest living garden plants, and they really form the structure of our gardens, and they impact all the other plants in our gardens. So when we're working in our gardens, the first thing we should be considering is the trees and their proper placement and what effect it'll have on the rest of our gardens. There are a lot of reasons why we love trees. There are personal reasons. They're just beautiful. A lot of us like to support wildlife. We enjoy seeing birds and squirrels and other things in our yards, and so the trees help to support that wildlife. From an economic point of view, mature trees on your property can increase your property values by as much as 20%. And at the same time, they give us privacy by screening views from neighbors, and they can also be used to hide unsightly views from our yard out into the countryside. And finally, they help to reduce our energy costs by providing shade and a windbreak. For the environment, they're also very important and helpful. They help to reduce runoff and control erosion, and they improve our air quality by absorbing pollutants while pumping oxygen out into the air, and they help with global warming by sequestering carbon dioxide. So when we're trying to figure out what the right tree for us is, the first thing we want to do is determine what's the purpose of the tree. What's the primary thing we're looking for that tree to provide for us? Is it food for ourselves and for wildlife? Or is it simply to provide a home for wildlife and attract wildlife with berries and fruits that they can enjoy? Perhaps we're looking for shade because we have the sun can be quite brutal come August and September around here. And ornamental value, they're pretty to look at and they'll enhance our landscape. And fall color, don't we all love the colors that we can get from the trees and as the leaves change in the fall and give us that sense of changing seasons? Well, let's look into each one of these a little bit. If we're selecting trees for food, some of the ones that are going to be recommended for our area that are very low maintenance are things like pecans. We can enjoy the fruits from the pecans. They're also great for wildlife, and there's really no maintenance to these sorts of trees. You don't have to do any spraying. They're just sort of out there, and we get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. A chestnut is another one that not only is it a beautiful shade tree, but it also provides wonderful chestnuts for us. And be careful because those burrs that cover the chestnuts are quite prickly, and you really need gloves to handle them. So if that's something that you don't want in your landscape, don't plant that tree. Walnuts are another wonderful nut tree that we can grow here with no maintenance. They can be a little bit messy, and the fruits, when they drop, if they land on concrete, can stain the concrete a little bit. But if you love walnuts, you can plant yourself one, and they'll do wonderful right here in Memphis. And of course, we all love the figs. A lot of trees, different varieties of fig trees will grow here in Memphis, and most of them are fairly winter hardy here. Sometimes on a real severe winter, some varieties may die back to the ground, but they'll come back up the next year. Other years we'll have some die back in the canopy, and we'll have to do a little bit of pruning, but it's well worth the effort to enjoy those wonderful figs.
Tom.
Yes. Is it not working?
Yeah, I'm not getting advance on my.
Okay. If we're looking at food for our trees, from our trees, apples are wonderful too. And even if you have limited room, you can espalier your apple tree. And you can do that by growing it in 2 dimensions. You just need to train it. It doesn't have to be up against a wall or a fence. It can be in the middle of your yard. You just need to provide some wires that you can train the branches to run along the wires in the shape that you're looking for and enjoy the harvest. Some of the ones that for our area that are well suited are listed here. And with the apples, there's a little more maintenance. You'll probably want to have some form of a spray program for your apples. Persimmons are another wonderful fruit that we can grow here, again, with very little care. And you can get them in different sizes. The dwarf, 8 to 10 feet, Asian are the ones that are going to give you these large fruits, these large orange fruits. The Fuyu Asian persimmon is one that's recommended here as a particularly nice product, nice form of persimmon. It stays firm when it's ripe. It keeps well for several weeks. It's seedless, heat tolerant, and it is one that the birds will enjoy too. I have a friend who has one of these growing in her yard, and I went to visit her in the fall, and she had brown paper bags tied all over her tree, and I was wondering why, and I asked her if it was to help the fruit to ripen, and she said, no, it's just to hide it from the birds. So the birds get the ones in the top of her tree, and she got to enjoy the ones that were lower. So everybody got to share in the bounty of that persimmon. The American persimmon is a much smaller fruit. It's the one that most people want to wait until there's a frost before the fruit sweetens up. So I would recommend the Asian if I were growing one for enjoying the fruit here. And the dwarf size is very easy to handle and to harvest. The Asian pear is another one that can grow. They grow similar to like an apple would on a tree, have firm texture to them. And again, they can be very low maintenance for you and enjoyed by you. And if you're looking for something a little bit different, there's the pawpaw. The foliage of the pawpaw is the sole source of food for the zebra swallowtail caterpillar. So that's another way that trees enhance wildlife. They often provide a source of food for a lot of the caterpillars, and of course, and you'll end up with an abundance of butterflies. The fruit of the pawpaw has large seeds in it, and it's kind of tropical in taste, and it requires 2 trees for pollination. If I were going to grow one of these, I'd recommend you perhaps get one that's a named variety. Okay, hang on a second. I think we have technical difficulties here.
That's what I said.
I'm going to stop for a second and let
There
me
it
check.
is. Now it's up.
Now it's up?
Yeah, look.
Okay. Is it still up?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here we go. So the pawpaw, it's actually a tropical fruit that survived the ice age and can be grown here. And the fruits can be used, they're sort of soft, but it's kind of custardy tasting. And they're a wonderful, unusual kind of plant that you can grow right here in Memphis. The pomegranate, who knew we could grow pomegranates here? They're lovely ornamental trees, get gorgeous orange blossoms on them. And I have a small one that I've been growing. It's an ornamental, a dwarf version, and it gets little fruits on it, but it's kind of cold susceptible, and it dies to the ground every year, and then it comes back for me. But it's pretty to look at. So I've gotten a large variety now. The one that I got is called Wonderful. And there's also a Russian one that both will do well in our area here. And they're smaller trees. And I'm going to try to espalier mine against my neighbor's house. And I'll be able to use that, grow that in my side yard and enjoy pomegranates in a few years. So let's select trees for shade now. If we were looking for shade trees, there's any number of trees that do well in our area. The dawn redwood and bald cypress are similar looking trees, and they're pictured here. They have a fern-like kind of texture to the leaves. They're very soft to the touch.
Not advancing.
It's not advancing. Okay. Let me go back. Now is it advancing?
I had the pomegranate.
Okay, let me do this. Maybe this will work better for us.
Now it's on my screen.
Okay. The dawn redwood and bald cypress are similar appearance. They're deciduous fir trees, and so those in the fall they'll turn. If you're not familiar with them, you might think they're dying. They turn a lovely sort of apricot colored, yellowish brown color in the fall, and then they'll drop all their needles and be bare during the winter. But they're beautiful trees and something a little bit unusual that other parts of the country, not everybody can grow these. Oaks of any type are great for shade here in Memphis, and they grow very well. And the bur oak and the cherry bark oak are two nice ones. But any number of red oaks and white oaks and are great plants for a lot of insects that are going to support your bird life, and a lot of them are going to create butterflies for you. Of course, the magnolia, famous for its southern beauty and the sweet smelling magnolia blossoms. Again, lots of different varieties. The southern magnolia is the one that gets so big, and we'd recommend that you let those branches grow to the ground, because these trees are going to be dropping their inner leaves during the course of the year, and it can be kind of a pain to clean up, and nothing will grow. It's a very dense shade and nothing's going to grow underneath it. And so if you let the branches grow to the ground, it contains all of that and you don't have to worry about it. It's a great climbing tree for your grandchildren or children. And so it's just a wonderful tree, but you need a good space for it. Red maple, a number of different red maples that do well here. Of course, the tulip poplar, our state tree. The Sweetgum, a lot of people don't like those because of the small gumballs that they drop that you could twist an ankle on if you walk on them. But if you put it at the back of your yard in a bed, those will fall into the bed and can serve as mulch. The Sweetgum balls, cats don't like walking on them, so if you have problems with cats getting into your beds, you can put all your Sweetgum balls in the bed to keep the cats out. They are beautiful trees in the fall with their fall color, as is the ginkgo, which is another old-timey tree that is just absolutely gorgeous in the fall. If we're looking for something to screen, a lot of times we're looking for things that are going to be evergreen, because when we look for screening, we don't want it just for part of the year. We're going to look for something that's going to be year-round to provide that. And cherry laurel is a wonderful tree that can be turned into a hedge. As you see in this picture here, it can actually be trimmed into a hedge. It has small leaves that look almost like a ficus tree leaf, the tropical ficus tree, and they have a shine to them. They get flowers early spring, but they're a wonderful evergreen tree that is quite versatile and wonderful as a screen, especially if you don't mind pruning it and making a hedge out of it. Southern wax myrtle, the anise tree, and southern magnolias in dwarf varieties. Little gem and teddy bear also can be used as screening trees. The luster leaf holly, and of course red cedars we're all familiar with. Sometimes we're looking just for ornamental value, and we're looking for things oftentimes that are going to provide some sort of a flower for us. And the American fringe tree will be covered with white, fine flowers in the spring, and it's just going to look like a big white cloud in your landscape. Of course, we're all familiar with the dogwoods. And in addition to the traditional dogwoods that we see blooming in late spring, there's summer blooming dogwoods and evergreen dogwoods. So lots of options there for the dogwoods. The red buds, they've done a lot of work with red buds, again, providing different leaf color, different growth habits. There's a lot of them that are more weeping that you can get now. and with different colored leaves, where the leaves have a lot of ornamental value, in addition to those lovely flowers that come out, and they pop out right out of the bark in the spring before the leaves bud out. And it's just an outstanding small tree with a lot of ornamental value. Japanese maples, absolutely fabulous trees, understory trees that are going to want some shade. So if you have large trees, you can plant these underneath and fill in those mid ranges in height, and absolutely gorgeous fall colors. And many of them, again, weeping varieties, upright varieties, and many of them have interesting look to them in the wintertime. The golden rain tree, again, a small tree that gets large flowers on it. The red buckeye pictured here has these candle-like upward growing blossoms in the early spring. And when the red buckeye is in bloom, you need to have your hummingbird feeders out, because that's one of the foods that the hummingbirds follow as they migrate north during the spring of the year. And so that's a good indicator for when you need to have your feeders out. Possum haw, or is another name for the deciduous hollies. This group of trees have holly-like leaves on them, and they get little small flowers, inconspicuous flowers in the spring that develop into red berries. And in the fall, the leaves will drop, and you'll be left with berries on your bare stems, and those will persist well into spring. Come about February, you'll often get birds. It's one of the last things that the birds will eat. They tend to find other things, but later in the winter, when their other things are scarce, the berries are desired by the birds because they're high energy foods, and you'll see robins and cedar waxwings and the mockingbirds love those. And of course, crepe myrtles are also great little trees. And if we need to think of those as trees, not as shrubs, and consider letting them just grow that way without cutting off the tops every year. A lot of people think you have to cut the tops off to get good flowering. That's not the case. When you do that, you get a lot of weak growth and clusters of it. And it's, a lot of work every year to go out there and cut those things back. So just let it grow into a tree form, and you can control the number of trunks that it has, either a single trunk or multiple trunk. But just let it grow its natural way, and you'll have a wonderful tree in your landscape. When we're looking to select trees for wildlife, a lot of the ones we talked about earlier, the large trees, the pecans, the magnolias, sweetgums, that are shade trees, are also great trees to attract wildlife, providing food for birds and squirrels and insects alike. There's a possum haw there with its berries on, and the cedar waxwing. Cedar waxwing migrate through here around February, and they'll come through, and if they spot your tree, they'll come, and in an afternoon, they'll clean every berry off that tree. They, just flock to it, and they'll feed on it and then go rest for a while, and another batch comes in and feeds on it, and it does your spring cleanup, and you won't have to worry about any berries laying in your yard. Small trees, dogwoods, hollies, serviceberry, persimmon, a lot of the ones that we talked about earlier are also great small trees for the birds. Red cedars, sassafras, the mimosa, and of course, fall color. Now, here in Memphis, we sometimes have difficulty with the fall color because our temperatures are hot and they don't cool down enough at night. And if we go into the fall with dry weather, that also tends to give us a duller color. This past fall, we had wonderful color, and it's because we had great timely rains late in the summer and early fall, and we had warm days and cool nights, and that's what really brings the color out. But some trees provide a lot more color than others, and so there are things like the Autumn Blaze and October Glory and Brandywine are all maples that have brilliant red color, and color up a little bit more than some of the other varieties. So if you're going to invest in a tree, you should take a little time, do a little research, and get one that's going to give you what you want. You know, you can get volunteer trees and stick those in the ground, and they'll do just fine for you. But if you get a named variety, you'll be assured that you're going to get that one attribute that they're particularly known for. And if you're going to plant a tree for shade and it's going to be a maple, why not plant one that's going to give you glorious color? And speaking of glorious color in maples, in a smaller version of that is the Japanese maple. There are, I think there's thousands now of varieties of Japanese maples, and each one has its own special attributes. Dancing Peacock is valued because of the gorgeous variegation on the color of the leaves as it comes into the fall. And it's just a beautiful small ornamental tree. Again, an understory tree that's going to grow underneath your shade trees along the edge of your wooded area. The Seigu Keiku is a coral bark Japanese maple. It also gets nice fall colorage, yellows with a little bit of red in it. But the beauty of this tree is that during the winter, the smallest branches are going to turn red. And the more sun that they have, the redder that those are going to be. And so that you get this extra ornamental value of the red twigs during the winter time. During the summer, they revert back and they don't have that red hue to them. They're just sort of ordinary lookings, but wonderful little surprise for you. But if you only could plant one Japanese maple, this is my recommendation. It's the Bihao version. It's a small ornamental Japanese maple. It gets yellow with, again, a little tinge of red to it in the fall. But look at that bark, that creamy yellow bark that persists all summer and all winter. But in the winter, you get the added benefit of the smaller branches turning red. So it almost looks like a flame out in your landscape. Absolutely gorgeous trees that give you that year-round value. Another great fall color tree is the Ginkgo. Again, a lot of different varieties of this. Some are upright and slender, some are rounded. So depending on your site and what you're trying to achieve, do a little bit of research. But the fun thing about the Ginkgo is they have a beautiful golden yellow fall color, and they just stand out in the landscape. And the entire tree will turn yellow. And then if we get a cold snap, they'll drop their leaves all within a matter of a few days. And so you get this big leaf drop and it becomes a yellow carpet in your landscape. And so you clean up your leaves, and it makes cleanup of your leaves very simple because you only have to do it once, maybe twice, and you get them all up and out of the way. But they're just gorgeous leaves on the tree, and small fan-shaped leaves, and just a fun tree. And the Sweetgum, again, we talked about that earlier being a great shade tree, but it does have those little gum balls. So plant it in the back of your yard if you want to avoid that issue. But they get wonderful fall color. They get yellows and reds and deep reds, and they kind of spotted. They don't necessarily always turn all at once. You'll get multiple different colors, and sometimes you'll have one branch that's red and one that's yellow. And they're just fun trees. They look great. And the small gumballs that do hang on there, they tend to hang on and drop off as through the course of the winter, but they almost look like little ornaments sitting up there, and it's all decorated for the holidays for you, and you don't have to do a thing. If you're really worried about the gumballs, you can get the Slender Silhouette, which will grow 35 to 50 feet tall, but only be 4 feet wide. Gets the same great fall color. It does get gumballs, but not as many. And when they do drop, they're going to drop straight down, and they are concentrated in a small area. So it's really not the issue that you have with the shade tree version of the sweet gum, with the branches that spread out all across your landscape. So so you can have the beauty, and you can have a very sculptural look to it, and not have to suffer with the issues around most of the gumballs. And one tree that is probably underused in our area is a native tree. It's the black gum, or the Tupelo tree, and it gets a great red color to it, and it's one of the earliest turning trees in our landscape. So you'll get early red color on the black gum, and it's a nice tree. And again, named variety probably give you a little bit better color, but even the run-of-the-mill one is a great tree for you to plant in your landscape. So we've determined the purpose of our tree. We know we want it for food, we want it for shade, we want it for ornamental value. A lot of times we can get all three of those in a single tree. So now that we've got that, and we've got a whole list of trees typically that are going to meet the needs that the purpose for it, now we have to determine, will it grow in our area? You want to have the right growing conditions for the tree that you select. It doesn't do you any good to have a beautiful tree that is going to suffer and struggle because our soil and growing conditions aren't right. You know, I love a white birch, and I would love to have white birch growing in my yard, or an aspen tree, but they aren't going to do well here. They'll just die on me, so I can't grow those. I have to pick something else. It's like these great sequoias and the giant redwoods that grow out in California. Well, those trees will grow in other parts of California, but it's only in a few select spots where you get the massive size on them that they're so renowned for. And that massive size and it's not a large area where they grow to those sizes. And but the conditions are just perfect for those trees to achieve that growth. So when we're looking at the things that we've got to be looking for, we have to be looking at the zone. Is it appropriate for our zone? The light conditions that we have, the drainage that we have. We tend to have very clay type soil here that is slow to drain. And we may have site restrictions. So we may fall in love with the tree, but we just don't have the space for it in our landscapes. So Memphis is in zone 7, and that tells us a little bit about the kinds of trees. And when you research a tree, it'll tell you what zones that it can grow in. And our soil conditions tend to be wet and bone dry. You know, we kind of have both conditions because our clay soil tends to hold water quite a bit when the moisture is available, but then we have that long period in the summer where we have very little rain, it seems, and the rain that we do get has trouble penetrating the dry soil. So to test your drainage, what you can do is you can dig a hole a foot wide and a foot deep and fill it with water. And if you come back 3 hours later and it's empty, you have excellent drainage, and you can select plants that tolerate dry conditions. If you come back sometime between 3 and 12 hours and it's draining, and by 12 hours it has drained, you're probably pretty good for anything you want. And if it's 12 hours later and there's still water in there, you know you have to plant things that can only deal with wet conditions. Now, some plants, the plants that deal with wet conditions tend to also be able to handle dry conditions, but the ones that need dry cannot tolerate the wet. So you have more options here in Memphis, where we tend to have poorer drainage than if we had just because of the dry ones can also do okay there. And then you want to know your light conditions. You know, if you love a Japanese maple or a dogwood, but you have full sun, it's going to be tough for you to grow those trees because those trees require a little bit of shade. So our site selection too, we have to look around a little bit and take into account, especially in our urban landscapes, what's going on? Do we have wires ahead that we have to deal with, either above or below ground? Walkways, how close to the house? We don't want the leaves, the branches growing into our roofs. We don't want branches growing out and obstructing our roadways. And of course, sewer lines can often get clogged with roots if we're not careful and don't plant the right tree. So perhaps the biggest issue is the power lines. And boy, if you want to see somebody get angry, you just follow the MLGDW crew as they go around and trim those power lines, because it upsets everybody every time they do it. And they come by every 3 or 4 years and do that trimming. And what they're doing is they're trimming a 15-foot break between their wires and the tree. So anything growing within 15 feet of those wires is going to be lopped off. And generally, they just lop it off at 15 feet. They don't take it back to the trunk. They're not paid to trim trees and prune them properly. They're just paid to get those branches 15 feet away, and that's what they're told to do, and they go out there and do it. So if you've got if you have power lines and you're going to plant underneath it, you need to plant a tree that's only going to get up to 25 feet or so. And then when you get 20 feet away from the tree, then you can start to plant a little bit larger trees, and your tall zone is going to be at 50 feet away from those power lines, where you can plant trees that are going to be higher than 40 feet. The medium would be about 40 feet, and then the small trees, everything you plant should max out at 25 or less. And that'll keep the MLGW people away from your trees. So it never amazes me why landscapers and people that plan these things plant large trees that are going to mature to a large size underneath power lines. So here's oak trees. Well, those oak trees want to be 100 feet tall, and they're never going to make it over 20. And they come by and they trim these things, and all they're going to have is giant trunks with a little umbrella on top of it. And it's just a waste. Not only is it ugly, but it's a waste of resources to trim them constantly. And it could be all avoided just by having a better tree there. Some trees, you get just half a tree, where they have to trim off the one side. So all these trees are leaning to the west because that's where all their branches are. And the east side has been removed by the power company. And this one, they just took out the middle because the power lines ran right down the middle of that tree, and they just trimmed it and kept going. So something smaller would have been a better choice. Great power line trees are things like the dogwoods, the crab apples, Chinese fringe tree, Japanese maples, but you need shade for that. So if you have shade from a building or something, you can plant those, as long as there's it's not full sun 24 hours a day or 12 hours a day. Red buds do well, the possum haw, red buckeye, and crepe myrtles. This is a picture of a gorgeous crepe myrtle, and it's a single trunk crepe myrtle. So oftentimes crepe myrtles want to send up multiple trunks, and if you just keep cutting those trunks back and every time they sprout, eventually they'll kind of give up, and you just let one be the main one, the leader, and it'll form into a beautiful ornamental tree that gets those wonderful flowers on it that we love so much. And it has a gorgeous bark to it, and that exfoliation as it occurs in the summer. And then it's got that nice smooth bark to it in the winter, very ornamental as a single trunk tree. So I'd recommend that if you like to go out and play around a little bit and have something a little unusual, because you don't see these too often here in Memphis. When we're working too, we have to look down, are there room for the roots? So here's a large tree planted right at the edge of the road, and it looks like those roots are trying to jaywalk as they cross the street there. Just not enough room for those roots to grow, and it just creates an issue. And if you're driving down that street, you've got this large obstacle right at the edge of the road, and it's just begging for somebody to hit it. Not only could they injure themselves, but they can injure the tree. So if you're going to plant a large tree, you don't want to do it right there at the edge. We have to also watch out for the roots of trees. As they mature, those roots get larger and they can disrupt things, creating unsafe conditions as sidewalks get lifted and safety concerns. Here's a number of trees. These probably all started as volunteers. A squirrel planted something, a nut there, or it was just blown there and landed, dropped by a bird. And instead of pulling those when they were just tiny little itty bitty trees, they left them grow. And now you can see the kind of damage that they're doing. And really the root, when it hits an obstacle that is solid, it can't go there. So it's going to follow the path of least resistance, and it'll hit that concrete foundation and go left or right or underneath. But what happens is each year there's a new layer of growth. Just like the tree that we see, the branches each year get a little thicker and a little bit longer. It's just an entire covering of the tree is renewed each year, and it gets a little bit bigger. And the same thing happens below ground in the roots. So those tiny little roots get a little bit bigger each year. And as they get bigger, they start to put pressure on things because their girth expands. And eventually that's what causes some of the damage. And it can be severe damage depending on the situation. Overhead damage potential are trees if they grow into our homes and they can rub against our roofs. They can cause the roof to leak. That's a highway for squirrels and raccoons to get onto our roofs, and just makes it easier for them. And next thing you know, they're trying to make a home. They're gnawing on your siding and making a home into your room, attic. So when you plant something, consider the size and plant it so those branches aren't going to grow into your house, or plan on pruning and the expense of doing pruning. If you have a restricted space, you can try things like these columnar trees we talked about earlier. The Slender Silhouette, American Sweetgum. Here it is planted at a hotel, and that's a little patio area, and they wanted some shade and perhaps some screening of the view. And so they planted these, and they're going to grow up to like fuzzy green telephone poles and provide some shade. But it fills in a nice architectural look to them, a nice green exclamation point, softening some of the hard edges of that building. And there's a ton of trees that are becoming more popular as you go around town. You can see some of these things now. But there's the columnar varieties of oaks, the tulip poplar, ginkgos, maples, red cedar, hornbeam, just about anything, even the Japanese maple. So you can find a tree for a tight spot that is going to require no pruning, and you could be 15 feet away from that telephone line and grow these things, and the phone company will leave them alone. Here's another great one. It's the Eastern Red Cedar. It's a variety called Taylor. And this is a wonderful screening plant, 20 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and they're evergreen. They never need shearing, never need pruning, and they have a beautiful silver green foliage, but they grow up like in an Italian villa where they have the Italian cypress. This is the American version of the Italian cypress. They're suited for our area, and they'll do great. They're native trees. And whereas this Italian cypress, you can try to grow it here, but you won't have a lot of luck. And they'll tend to die out on you. But the alternative to that is the Taylor variety of Eastern Red Cedar, just gorgeous trees. The water lines become a problem too. So any place there's a joint or a crack in your water lines, your sewage lines, a tiny little rootlet can get in there. And once it gets in there, it's going to go crazy because there's a lot of nutrients and moisture in there. And that's what the trees are seeking. And it grows this network of feeder roots that eventually fill up and clog the line, impeding any flow. And as those roots get bigger, they can cause more damage. and crack your pipe greater, and more roots can get in. So when you're dealing with this sort of thing, you want to avoid those trees that are going to be a particular problem. They just love the water and they seek it out and are very good at doing it. So things like a silver or a Norway maple, the sweetgum likes the water, river birch, cottonwood, sycamore, and willow. Keep those away from where your sewer lines are. So if your sewer lines come from the street in the front of your house up to your house, you want to plant those types of trees in the back of your property. So just right siting and a little bit of thought process is going to save you a lot of heartache and expense. And sometimes we're looking for our sight lines and we're trying to screen things. If you a windbreak, this first little picture up here is an idea of a windbreak where you're screening the neighbor's view at a low height, but it's also serving as a windbreak. The second one, sometimes you'll live on a T intersection street where the street ends and the cars drive down, they're pointing right at you. Well, a small hedge or a small tree there is going to screen those headlights, provide you with some privacy, but also keep those lights from glaring into your windows. And again, of course, the sun providing shade and cooling our house and are providing a lovely environment for us to enjoy the outdoors during the summer. And again, privacy. So the other thing about trees is that trees and grass don't get along. Trees create a lot of work for us. We have recleafing, we have the leaves that drop, we've got gumballs that drop, we've got other clutter that drops off the trees, gets in our gutters, we got to clean and prune all the time. But that's low work compared to turf, which is high maintenance. You have to mow it every week. We got to do a lot of watering and feeding and weed control. And so turf's expensive. The turf allows the sun, for sun to come and provide a lot of flowering plants. We can grow things that we can't if we got shade. But the trees provide the shade. They break the wind for us. They save us money on our utilities. Trees also provide a habitat for wildlife, a place for birds and squirrels to nest and provide food for them. But again, an open area is great for birds too that forage in the lawn for insects and things, so bluebirds and robins like that. And a turf lawn, again, is going to prevent the risk of damage from falling leaves and clogged drains and all the things that trees can create. But trees with proper placement, you don't have those issues either how. Anyway, so some people like trees, some people like turf, and most of us want them both. And is there room for both? Well, not directly, because trees and grass kind of work against each other. So the tree is going to provide too much shade for grass. And so then we're going to plant grass that's more shade tolerant. The zoysia, some of the special varieties of zoysia. And when that fails, then we're going to try and plant things like fescue. And, again, a lot of work to do that. And then we're going to be feeding that grass and putting fertilizer and weed killer on it. And the trees don't need either of that. In fact, those things can be bad for the trees. Most of the feeder roots of a tree are about 6 inches below the surface of the soil, and they extend out well beyond the canopy of the tree. And they're sucking up water. And when we water our grass, the grass is going to try and suck up the water. So the both of them are kind of suffering because there's not enough water for both of them. And that heavy nitrogen fertilizer is not good for the tree, nor is the herbicides that we put on there. So when we talked about having trees, one thing we can do to have grass under our trees is to try to have a variety of a tree with more of an open canopy that lets some of the more sunlight. They don't have as dense a shade as in a different tree would. We can have an arborist come out and thin the trees and remove some of that canopy to let more light in. Again, we can use those shade-tolerant grasses. And if we want the grass, we're going to have to be very diligent about getting our leaves up. We can't let the leaves lay on our lawn and mat down, and that'll tend to create fungus problems and rot problems and shade problems, and it's not good for the grass, and it'll tend to kill the grass. So you got to be diligent about getting your leaves up. And if we go with those grasses like the fescue that are going to do a little better under the tree, we're going to have that green. They're cool season grasses. So during the winter is where they'll be nice and green and lush. And during the summer, they tend to get straggly looking when our warm season grasses are great. So you've seen a lot of these homes where around trees during the winter, you'll see a lot of green grass underneath it. And in the summer, not so much. It's kind of like a two-tone lawn. And I personally find that not so attractive, but you can do that. So if we want a tree and we want a lawn area, maybe we just need to minimize the amount of lawn that we have, plan it out so that we've got an area that provides us space for a lawn, but also plenty of room for our trees to grow where they're not going to compete with each other. And so underneath that tree, what are you going to put that you can deal with that shade? One thing would be mulch. It'll provide a nice sitting area for you. You can put a water feature underneath there. You can even use artificial turf. Now you may laugh and you may say, how can a master gardener be talking about artificial turf? Well, you know, it is good looking. It's going to be green all year. It requires very little maintenance. And some of the artificial turfs out there today, if you buy a premium one, they're quite attractive and you know they look good. So it's acceptable if that's what you want. The other thing you'll put underneath the trees are different ground covers, things like mondo grass, lily of the valley, pachysandra, creeping jenny, creeping thyme, clover, moss, a number of low-growing greenery that's going to provide greenery either year-round or half the year, 9 months out of the year anyway, and provide some ground cover for you and be attractive. And then you could have a shade garden, establish a shade garden underneath your tree. You've got the shade, why not take advantage of it? And so there's spring ephemerals that come up early in the spring and flower and look beautiful, and then they kind of fade with the heat that comes along later. You can put bulbs, a lot of spring bulbs. They come up, bloom, and they absorb enough energy in the early part of the year when the leaves are off the trees that they can replenish themselves for the next year, and they continue the cycle year after year and do well. Hydrangeas, a number of different hydrangeas can be grown in shade. Of course, azaleas, mahonias, camellias, which you can get 6 months of bloom out of by choosing the right camellias. There's spring bloomers and fall bloomers, and so you can get a long extended bloom period. A number of different wonderful shrubs that you can grow and create a beautiful shade garden that has a lot of architectural and beauty to it. And ferns, of course, do well in the shade. So we've picked out our tree. We know why we want it. We picked one out that's right for the conditions. Now that we've got it in the ground, how do we take care of the tree? So let's look at some of those things. First, the tree mechanics. On the outside, you have the bark, and the bark is there. It's like our skin. It kind of protects ourselves against scrapes and scratches and kind of holds everything in there. The phloem is conductive tissue that carries nutrients made by the leaves and brings it down into the roots to feed the roots and to store it. Cambium layer, that's the growth ring, and that's the layer that creates new tissue each year, and it creates both the xylem and the phloem, and does lays down a layer of that each year for us, and each one gets a little bit bigger each year. And so that's the living tissue, and if that gets damaged, if you ruin that, you're going to kill your tree. So you got to be very careful about that. You don't want to be damaging anything. You really don't want to be penetrating the bark at all. Sapwood, or the xylem, that carries moisture up into the leaves and energy into the leaves that lets us get that early growth in the spring and forces the buds out and supports that leaf formation. And then the heartwood is sort of the sapwood that's kind of clogs up over years, and that really gets filled up with resins and gums and provides like a column to support the tree over time. And so that just gets bigger. So the real workhorse is the cambium, and then the veins and arteries are the phloem and the xylem that transport food and minerals and moisture up into the canopy and down to the roots. So the best time to plant a tree was about 50 years ago. The next best would be today, because when you're planting a tree, you're a long-term thinker. It's going to let the trees live longer than we do. They last a lifetime. And so that's why it's so important to pick a good tree and put it in the right spot. But when we're planting a tree, mid-October to mid-December is a real good time, because during the winter here in Memphis, the ground is moist. The ground doesn't get frozen like it does in northern climes. And those roots will grow all winter long for us, and it allows those roots to get well established before the spring comes and the demand for that new growth comes, and we've got a good root development. And so that's the advantage of planting in the fall. Next best time would be early spring, and so that's coming upon us. But it's not too late to plant a tree right now, as long as the ground's not frozen. And of course, in the wintertime, there's minimal watering needs, because we get more rain at that time, and the moisture tends not to dry out because of the cooler temperatures. So when you buy your tree, you're either going to get it balled and burlapped, wrapped in usually some sort of burlap, or oftentimes there's a wire net underneath the burlap. Container grown, which means it's growing in a pot of some sort, or we'll get them bare root, where there's just the roots with no soil on them. The bare roots tend to be smaller trees when you get those. So when we plant a tree, what we want to do is we want to dig a hole 2 to 3 times wider than the diameter of the root ball, but no deeper than the root ball. If anything, we want to plant our trees high here in Memphis, because we have that clay soil that tends not to drain so well. And when you dig the hole, sometimes if it's moist, you're going to get real smooth sides. Just take your shovel and kind of scar that up a little bit, put some little divots in it. That'll give the roots a place to kind of grip, and makes it easier for them to grow out into the surrounding area. And when we take the plant out, we want to inspect the roots, and we don't want those roots to dry out. So it helps to soak the plant and give it a real good watering before you plant it, and then take it out and inspect the roots. And if you see these girdling roots, these circling roots like that, you want to prune those, because if those grow around in a circle, those are going to eventually kind of choke off the flow of nutrients. It just tightens up over time, and can cut off the flow of nutrients and cut off the flow through the roots, and those roots will die. And if you have dead roots, you're going to have a dead tree. So especially in container tree grown plants, you want to look for that. And sometimes they'll pot them up. And so they have them in a small pot, and they'll put them in a bigger pot. And so you can have, even though the outside looks good, you can have some of those circling roots in the middle. And so whenever I plant a tree, I tend to turn it into a bare root. I try and get a good inspection of those roots, separate them and make sure they're cleaned out. If it's a balled and burlapped tree, you want to make sure you remove any wire basket or synthetic burlap that's not going to rot and get that out of the way. So we've got our hole dug. We're going to spread the roots and we're gently going to backfill with the original soil. And the original soil, we used to talk about enriching the soil, and a lot of people want to do that today. What we found is you don't really want to enrich the soil. When you enrich the soil, you're creating an environment that's a lot like having it in a container. And, you know, it's like our 20-something kids that, you know, live with us forever. They know they've got it good at home and they never leave. Same thing with the roots. If they've got a nice little environment, they're going to stay right there where they've got plenty of moisture and nutrients, and they're not going to want to go out into our native soil. If we backfill with native soil, that makes them go out because they're going to be looking for nutrients and things, and it's going to get that tree well established and get those roots out, growing where they need to be gathering in the nutrients and moisture that they need. So we've got it in there. We want to make sure the tree is straight as we backfill it, and we water it well to make sure there's no air gaps or air holes in there, and boom, we're done. We mulch it to within 2 inches of the base of the tree to help retain moisture, and that mulch also helps to keep lawnmowers away. You know, if we got a ring of mulch around there, you don't have to get close with the lawnmower or the weed whacker, and so you don't end up accidentally damaging the trunk of the tree. And you don't need to stake the tree in most cases. Sometimes if the tree tends to be floppy for some reason, if it's top heavy, it might need a little bit of support, but no more than for a year or 6 months until we want a little bit of movement. That helps to strengthen the tree and get the roots strong and kind of exercises them. But if it is floppy in there and you have too much movement, then it can kind of create a little hole around the trunk where a lot of water and moisture can kind of settle in there and lead to rotting, which we don't want. So generally you don't have to stake them, but occasionally you might. So our trees, a lot of things that we need for tree care. One of the things that trees need is air. We tend to forget about that. And so our soil, a good soil that's got good drainage and good organic matter in there, it's got a lot of moisture, a lot of air in there too, a lot of oxygen. And it should be about almost 50% oxygen. And one of the ways we get it is having a nice friable soil by having a lot of organic matter, but you know, insects and earthworms help form tunnels and get air down into the roots for us as well. So we want to encourage those sorts of things. And so the healthy roots are going to be a healthy tree. That's the key to a strong, healthy tree. So we want to monitor it for 2 years after we follow planting. The first year, we're going to baby it a little bit, make sure that it gets enough water, especially during hot, dry, and windy conditions. If we've planted it at a time of year where it tends to be drier, we're going to want to be even more diligent about that. If we doesn't, so that it can get itself established. We're going to prune it as needed, removing any dead or damaged branches, or to remove a hazard. You know, sometimes a low branch, you know, if it's in an area where traffic, you're going to be walking by, you don't want to be banging your head, so you might want to remove that branch. Crossing and rubbing branches should be removed. Suckers, anything growing up from the base, you want to remove that, or any upright growth from off one of the branches that's growing straight up, you should remove those as well. And sometimes we just want to improve the appearance. You know, we don't like the way it looks and aesthetically, and so we want to, you know, remove something. And so when we prune, we want to follow the 3-cut method. And the idea behind this is that if you just make a single cut, as that weight of that branch comes down, it's going to break it, and before you get that cut all the way through, and there's a strong danger that as it breaks, it's also going to rip the bark down the face of the tree. And that's not good for the tree. That's a terrible wound for it. And so what we want to do is we want to make a cut on the bottom of the branch out a little ways. And what that's going to do is that when we make the second cut out further, just a little further, that we're going to cut through, if it breaks too soon, it's going to break back there, and that little notch that we made there is going to keep it from ripping it on down. And so once we've removed the weight of that branch and the leaves and all the twigs out there, now we've got just this one little stub, and then we can make a nice clean cut. And where we want to cut it is right where the branch, top and bottom, are parallel. And we want to leave what we call this branch collar, where these, where it comes out here and there's a little bit of a flare. And just when they start to be parallel is where that cut's made. And that allows these specialized cells to heal over that wound. And it happens pretty quickly. And trees, when they're injured, such as in removing a limb, they don't scab over, they don't have that ability. So they tend to compartmentalize, and they seal it off by growing over and closing off that area to keep out any risk from insects and disease entering there. And it takes a while, but that's the natural process. If we leave the stub out here, these cells around the edge, they don't have the ability to grow and cover over. It's just the specialized cells that are in this branch collar that do that. And so this stub will just die, and then things can kind of get in there and work their ways back and into the trunk itself. So we don't want to seal that. We don't want to put any wound sealer on there, because anytime you paint over that, you're actually creating a bigger problem than leaving it by itself. When we paint a house, the thing that causes paint to bubble and not seal well and fail is moisture. As there's moisture behind there, it keeps that paint from sticking, and it bubbles up and starts to flake off. So there's a lot of moisture inside that tree. And if we paint over it with tar or a layer of concrete or just plain old paint, the moisture behind there creates a little void, and now you've got the perfect environment for fungus and rot to occur. And so leave it open, leave the wound open, and let it heal itself. That's what the tree's designed to do. So here's another real life example of what a proper cut would be. When you're using small branches, you can follow the 3-cut too if you want. Get that weight off there, and then make your second cut. And again, you're going to do it right where they're parallel, and leave that branch collar for healing. And there's other things that we talked about. These suckers that grow straight up off the branch, we want to remove those. These downward branches that are going to be in the way, remove that. Some suckers at the bottom. Rubbing branches, we want to remove those. Anything that's dead. And then sometimes just something like this broken branch we'd remove, or something for aesthetics. Depending on the tree and its location, sometimes it'll try and develop multiple leaders. Generally, we want a single leader going up, and all the branches coming off at right angles. We don't want to top our trees. Sometimes you'll see beautiful large oaks that somebody came through and topped them. What that means is they've done header cuts that whenever you cut something and prune a tree, you want to take it back to the branch or back to the trunk where you make your cut. When you make these stubs with long stubs, you'll get a lot of tiny little tender growth coming out of there, and they have a tendency to break off. But the other thing is that sometimes they do that. They say, well, we're going to try and control the size of the tree by doing that. Well, within 3 years, that tree is going to have just as much top growth on it as it had before you pruned it. And it's going to be weak top growth that's going to be tend to break, and you're going to have a lot of disease and other things entering into the tree, and you've just signed a death knell. It's going to take a while, but it's just not right. Now, sometimes they do that because people are trying to grow the sticks. They want to harvest those sticks for whatever reason, and that's called pollarding, and it's a practice that you can do, and that's fine if that's what you're doing, but make sure you know what you're doing when you do it and you have the intention of doing it. So our crepe myrtles, when we do this, that's what we're doing. We're cutting off all these things, taking these header cuts, and then we get all this weak growth coming out of there. And it's hard to kill a crepe myrtle, and so it's probably not going to die. But it's not particularly attractive, and it's not the way the tree is supposed to grow, and it's not a proper pruning technique. So few residential trees die of old age. Either they're taken down because somebody didn't like them, they were afraid of them. A tree in the wrong spot, sometimes we're afraid of them. We think it's going to fall on the house or it gets in the way of something, and so we take it down. So right tree in the right place prevents that problem. But a lot of times we do things, we kill our trees with kindness. We do things that, we don't intentionally want to cause problems. We hang things on it that cut into the bark and end up killing the branch as they tighten up over the years. We always want to either hang it from a single thing with a screw that went into the tree and is hanging downward where it can compartmentalize around that, or we want a nice loose loopy thing that gives the tree room to grow. But a lot of things that we do, things like guy wires, when we stake a tree that can girdle the trunk over time, we do it and then we forget about it, or the landscaper comes in and does it and nobody thinks about it after that, and it ends up girdling the tree and cutting it. We talked about coating the pruning cuts, wrapping the tree. Sometimes you'll see trees that have a wrap around the trunk, and particularly maples here have a situation where they'll often get the bark splitting in the wintertime when it's been cold and freezing temperatures, and then the next day is nice and sunny, and that sun hits the bark and warms it up, and so one side is hot and the other is cold, and it causes the bark to split. And so sometimes if we have a tree not quite in the right spot, or it doesn't have enough canopy on it yet, we'll wrap the trunk with a paper, and that paper is, you start at the bottom and go up towards the top, but you'd probably want to rewrap it every couple of years, or you could just paint the trunk with a white spray paint, and that'd reflect the light and it'd keep it from splitting. But generally, we don't have to do that. Improper mulching, where you underneath a tree using non-porous black mulch, and then we put more mulch on top of that. Black plastic is never a good thing in the landscape because it prevents air exchange with the soil, and it prevents moisture from getting in there. And so black plastic's a no-no. Too much mulch prevents air from getting into the soil and that gas exchange that we want. And certainly we want to keep the mulch away from the trunk. Overwatering, we can kill a tree with overwatering too. Again, considering the fact that we have slow draining soil, and when you've got a clay soil and water fills up all the voids, that means there's no air there. So if there's no air, we're not getting the gas exchange, the roots aren't getting the oxygen that they need, and so that creates a problem. So this ring of mulch we talked about keeps the mowers away, keeps the weed whackers away, but we want to keep that ring away from the trunk of the tree about 3 or 4 inches. A lot of times you'll see what we call volcano mulching, where they've piled the mulch up around the base of the tree. What that does is you've created a compost pile. You've created a place where rodents are going to want to get in there and live in this pile. They're going to want to munch on the tree. But what happens in a compost pile? Things rot. And so when you put this up high around the bark, that bark starts to rot. You can get disease entering there, and before long, the tree just topples over because you've killed it because it's rotted out down there. So you can grow things in a compost pile, but you're planting it on top of the compost, not in the middle of it, deep down. And so that's why you don't want to do the compost mulching. So a lot of the unintentional damage that can happen from soil compaction, driving our cars or walking, having a path that covers over the feeder roots can compact the soil, preventing moisture to get in, can keep gas exchange from occurring. That's not good. Drought, disease, things happen sometimes. Root damage, severing our roots. Sometimes we'll put in a land irrigation system, and if they cut a straight line with a trencher, you're cutting the roots of that tree, and you can cut off its supply. All those feeder roots that are out there, you can cut off. So if you're going to trench near a tree, you always want to trench inward towards the trunk. You don't want to go parallel to the trunk because that's where you're going to create the most damage. But nailing and attaching items to the tree, you can do it, but depending on how you do it, you can do some real damage. So planting a tree can be your legacy. It's going to live well beyond you, and only optimists are going to plant a tree. So that's what you want to do, I think. And if you want to plant one, but you don't have room in your yard, a lot of cities, the city of Bartlett has a memorial tree program where you can honor someone living or deceased with a tree, and the city will plant one in one of their parks and tell you where it's at, and it's a nice little program they have. You can also do the same sort of thing with the National Forest Service. If you want to learn more about trees, two good sources are the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council and treesaregood.org is another good resource for information on trees. So there you have it. We may have a garden tour on June 5th here in Bartlett. It's going to depend on COVID whether we can do that, but keep an eye out for that. And with that concludes the presentation. And let me stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that. And y'all can ask me some questions if you have any here on comments. Okay. I don't see any comments there, so thank you for attending. Next week, we're going to be having a talk about bulbs given by David Fuchs, and it's all about growing bulbs in Memphis, ones that do well here for us. So, Kathy, do you have anything you want to mention?
No, it was just a wonderful presentation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll see you next week.